The beautiful afternoon, but we got work to do. We're here at CAWTAC meeting number 18, and today we are going to focus on development-ready land. I know this is a topic from those of you that I spoke to in interviews, that this is a topic that many people were especially interested in. Hopefully you had a chance to review the discussion memo that's linked in the agenda. In particular, I know page 4 of that memo has a list of questions that we might touch on today, or we hope to touch on today. There's some broader questions that are listed in your agenda, and then some more specific ones that we'll get to through our presentation that Maddie will walk us through. But first, I'm going to hand it to Karin to introduce our focus area and questions for today from the racial equity framework.
Great. Can we pull up that slide and I'll have it up briefly. We can take the slides down. So focus areas that we're familiar with: historical inequities and benefits and burdens, as we think about capital improvement planning, housing production, and development readiness. In that next slide, Ingrid, in your agenda, you'll see some framing or some questions around historical inequities, particularly if we think about trade-offs that we should consider when we make investments that could spur development or redevelopment. Some very positive impacts and outcomes that can come out of that, and also unintended consequences, understanding histories of displacement and gentrification in our communities. And thinking about benefits and burdens. How do the proposed approaches that we're going to give you today, how does it help mitigate burdens? How does it extend benefits? Who's benefited? Who's burdened? Where do we see those benefits? And so I wanted to ground us. Maybe I thought I would answer these questions with another question rather than leaping into responses to these questions. Back in June, Al Johnson, one of our TAC members, and he's not able to be here today while he's traveling, but Al had posed this question during discussion, I think in June of last year. And he asked us all to think about, how can cities encourage access through investment in public infrastructure to areas of opportunity that have historically been exclusionary to many marginalized or underrepresented communities in our area. And I thought about this for a while. And, you know, when I think about development readiness being a part of the housing production strategy, what we've been discussing is oftentimes you'll need to respond to a lack of development ready land. And those responses and those actions that are selected by a local government will need to be paired up by strategies to mitigate undue burden to communities that have historically had less access to opportunity, less access to housing choice, and have had greater challenges in housing affordability. And what can those production strategies look like? What actions can we take? Many of us were at the Oregon chapter of the American Planning Association, the conference last year, and I just wanted to direct folks to one of the presentations was Building and Belonging. It was a presentation by Metro staff and City of Portland staff. I think Andrea Pastor, Catherine Hardinger, and Jamie Dumais from Portland. And the presentation about building and belonging brought in these concepts of how do you mitigate displacement during capital investment planning. And the theories of change that they had is there are certain capital investment and infrastructure investments that a community can make, and they can choose to do it in a way that bonds local communities together. They can choose to do it in a way that bridge local communities to other communities, that creates greater resilience. So as we think about upgrading infrastructure as a catalyst to development and redevelopment, what are we doing in partnerships with local community organizations to provide affordable housing opportunities? What are we doing around community benefits agreements to look at employment and entrepreneurship opportunities and skills? There's a variety of different action selections that I think fit really nicely into the Housing Production Strategy Program. So I wanted to put that framework out there as we think about development readiness, the need for it, and the response to a deficiency of development ready land, what investments might be sought after at the local level. All right, I think we can take these slides down, and Steve, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Karen, for setting that framework for us. Just a reminder to everyone, big picture, I'm going to let Maddie do most of the introduction here, but big picture, we're asking you for any concerns or refinements you have to proposed rules and any recommendations you have around guidance. That's kind of the big picture umbrella of what we're looking to you for. But Maddie, go ahead and let's get to the specifics.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for spending your beautiful afternoon with us here at the CowTAC meeting. Again, I'm Madeline Phillips, I'm the Public Facilities Planner, and I appreciate the time you've all taken to read some of the materials that went out ahead of time. And also, I look forward to your comments and questions that you may have related to the work that we're about to review. At a high level, I'm going to ground us in where we are in the Goal 10 housing process, and then take you through some refinements related to the development ready land inventory and ask for your feedback about some specific elements related to the draft or proposed language that you'll see as attachment A to the memo that went out. One thing that we will ask at the very top of the refinement of the memo, so we'll go through the memo and then we'll ask a straw poll question at the conclusion of that memo review about where you are. It's very similar to the last meeting we had where folks responded to where you are in terms of likely support or support with some clarifications or modifications, or do we need to totally relook at the question related to the code language or the proposed draft administrative rule language related to development ready land inventory work. And then we'll get into some specifics about those nitty gritty items that you'll see were either highlighted or called out in that draft attachment A. And at the conclusion of this, I'm hoping that we can zoom out a little bit and talk more about how this might support some of the work that cities do around Goal 10, jurisdictions, excuse me, and then how we strike a balance between what's in rule and what is spoken to more specifically in guidance. So to jump right in, you'll remember the context of Goal 10. I think most of you all have seen this slide either in a previous CowTAC meeting or in other contexts. But specifically, what we're talking about today is the part about Goal 10 that focuses on assessment of land capacity and development readiness. So this gets to the step in the Goal 10 process related to buildable land inventory and the relationship of buildable land to this new term, development ready land. And to do that, we'll go through some of the discussion that I've included in the memo that you've read. Some of that material was commentary about how some of this information, how we arrived at some of this information, but some of it was pretty novel and new. And a lot of it came from discussions that some of you all participated in if you volunteered to be part of that infrastructure subcommittee. And I want to take a moment before we get too far, just to refresh everyone's memory of the definition of what land is considered development ready. And you'll remember that the statute 197A, in this case, the definition of the term is listed here, 015, and there's additional clarification about when this work happens in 197A 210. What's important to emphasize and what you'll see very clearly in some of the commentary included in the memo that you have in front of you is that there's a distinction between buildable land and development ready land. And I liked the way that folks characterized this in our June and July meetings of last year, where there was a distinction of is buildable. In fact, a person who's not here, Karen Burrick, who filled in for Martha Fritzy from Clackamas County, made a clarification in that discussion, which was, so are we talking about a subset of buildable land that is considered development ready? And yes, that's exactly it. There is land that we inventory related to buildability, or is it buildable within that 20-year planning horizon? And there's a lot of well socialized ways that is characterized, both through vacancy, delineation of vacancy, partial vacancy, and the practice of buildable land is very known, I think, within this group and to the planning profession in Oregon at large. What is new is that legislators in House Bill 2001 in the 2023 session identified development ready land as something distinct from that. And the distinction is not just, is it buildable, is it vacant or partially vacant in our inventory, but is it likely or ready for development within the planning horizon of the housing production strategy, which for folks in the metro area is 6 years, for folks outside of the metro is 8 years. And the definition of development ready land, as you'll see here, includes annexed and zoned. And we had a fairly robust conversation about the term annexed because of the applicability in some cases to counties that perform this work on behalf of communities within the county that are unincorporated. So there was a robust conversation that we had in June about that. Readily served or identified for near-term provision. So there's this, is the infrastructure in the ground or on the ground currently, and that land has access to it, or is it identified in a near-term investment opportunity, meaning near-term being that HPS window of 6 to 8 years. You'll see that in the memo, there's a delineation of that with some very generous assumptions, which is that the infrastructure takes a year to build and the housing itself takes a year to build. So in order to fit it into the window, assume near term means whatever your HPS term timeline is -2. Just to know that it will happen within that period. And then finally, not encumbered is, or having the appropriate entitlements. You'll hear a very parallel reference to some of the work you discussed in the last meeting around constraints and or encumbrances that are the result of federal, state, or local protective regulations. Some of those might be cultural or historic, or particularly in our context related to Goal 5, or that the land has the appropriate entitlements and can achieve those entitlements in enough time to be considered ready for development. That said, the work that we're asking cities and jurisdictions to do as a result of this development ready land inventory will inform housing production strategies. It will in no way inform the urban growth boundary amendment process. So that's a really important distinction that we'll continue to revisit and come back to, because it's easy when we think about the context, and especially at the local level, it's easy to conflate those two things. That something isn't served or isn't ready for development, and therefore we need to do something about the amount of land that we have within the urban growth boundary. There's a very clear delineation, both in statute and we hope in rule, that eliminates that connection, or at least delineates what each thing informs appropriately. Secondly, you'll see that's spelled out very clearly in ORS 1978210 and describes the communities that shall inventory development ready land. And then secondly, that the housing production target is the guiding star of the development ready land inventory. How does a city or jurisdiction know that they have sufficient development ready land? Is a topic of conversation that we'll have a little bit more robustly today. And it's that cities, as a result of determination of sufficiency, will take actions within the housing production strategy in order to best fulfill the intent of the housing production targets. So again, we're talking about communities that are subject to the housing production target, Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Program. So those are over 10,000 in population, and that those actions that result from the results of the development ready land inventory are those that inform the selection of housing production strategies. Are there any questions or concerns about anything I've shared so far before we move forward? Wonderful. Please don't hesitate to raise your hand if for some reason there's something that I've missed or I'm glossing over that you want to make a point about. So we've talked about the statute and definitions. I'm just going to get into some elements related to development ready lands that are included in the memo. And I hope that as I go through these, you'll help by raising your hand or asking questions if there's something that you might need clarified. When we conclude the review of the memo itself, that's when we'll do a straw poll just for the DLCD side folks, Steve and Ingrid. When we finish the memo conversation, we'll go about the details of the attachment A. You'll notice that there's a fair amount of discussion, and I tried to make this as colloquial as possible because it is a very technical inventory process. This is eventually, I think, with the Rules Advisory Committee in mind. I was hoping that we could boil down some of the concepts that we talk about at a technical level so that it's manageable and shareable with folks that may or may not be in this technical realm of planning that we work in. So you'll see that there are some definitions that were informed by not just the discussions in June and July of last year with this group, but also with the infrastructure subcommittee. Thank you again to those folks who participated. And they identified, and we all have identified 3 areas that really needed more clarification and definition. And those you'll see on the second page related to the following statements. So readily served by adjacent public facilities, identified for near-term provision in an adopted capital improvement plan, and housing capacity of development-ready lands. And those were 3 elements, 3 areas that needed unpacking. And so I'll go through those and unpack those shortly. Readily served by adjacent public facilities, and I may take the presentation down so that we're able to see each other. Readily served by adjacent public facilities. So there were a variety of comments that we received that were related to land that might be served, what qualifies readily served, and there was at least a level of consensus from many conversations that the distance that folks use for the DEQ expectation that a property will connect to a sewer facility that's within 300 feet was a very reasonable and somewhat, if you argue what that kind of extends to, is that that's somewhat of a proportionate distance that individual lots might seem like a reasonable element or distance to be considered readily served, so that there's an adjacent facility available that if a developer wanted to develop a property within 300 feet is at least a standard that is currently used in both the development market and in planning applications. There were concerns, capacity limitations, that just because a property is served physically, that land may not be able to achieve, I guess, what we've been discussing in the buildable land inventory context as achieved density. So you'll recall that in the HCA, a jurisdiction goes through a process where they identify what achieved densities have been accomplished within certain zone designations. And so that's somewhat of the gold standard of what this aims to point at, knowing that there are a lot of variations about what density, maximum, minimum, there's a huge range. How do we think about serving that range of options? We're very concerned. I think I would highlight a level of concern if a property is unable to reach an achieved density. of that zoning designation. So imagine a medium density residential zoning designation that has a range from 8 to 18 units an acre. That in the buildable land inventory, a jurisdiction would have this information on hand after completing their BLI, and they could say with certainty that we've achieved 11 units an acre in that medium density zone. And so that's the gold standard by which we might apply capacity, whether or not a line has capacity limitations. Can you achieve 11 units an acre on the parcel that's zoned for such development or not? And the qualification of is it ready for development or not is whether or not it can achieve that 11 units an acre. So that's just a quick clarification. And then of course there are physical barriers that sometimes are unique to properties. We heard that loud and clear from both infrastructure subcommittee members and CowTAC members, that there are so many one-off unique circumstances that might prohibit a property from accessing either a roadway facility or a water line facility or other public facilities that are critical to its ability to develop. And those areas that are unable to access facilities, even if they're within 300 feet, they might have to travel through an adjacent property and maybe don't have an easement or don't have an arrangement like that. Those properties likely cannot be identified as development readily served rather. That said, you'll hear in those qualifications that an accepted agreement, so a recorded easement with a property or the ability of a property to gain access through an adjacent property, any kind of recorded document or development agreement that says we will build or we can build in order to access utilities, that might be sought through a land use process or otherwise, those would all qualify property as readily served. You'll see in the conversation, I tried to break out the topics and then why it matters, sort of like the so what of each of these. And the so what of readily served is that we've got, we're aiming to achieve near-term opportunities for housing production. And there's a certain ability for a city to set the table for development opportunities that we're hoping this looks at. You'll recall from, if you have great memory, you'll recall from the July meeting, we talked quite a bit about the reactivity of cities and the current process of how public works typically responds to inquiries that are of interest by owners or developers or others. And it's not until that point of response that sometimes jurisdictions are prepared to delineate exactly what city standard looks like in those contexts. Our hope is that with the development ready land inventory process, that cities and jurisdictions become slightly more proactive in identifying where some larger facilities or facilities that might require public participation are located, and perhaps if there's imperative, that there's an opportunity for those communities to begin the process of thinking about how might those facilities be paid for, or is there for example, an infrastructure funding plan for some of those facilities that would support interests or inquiries. I mentioned at that meeting many months ago that there are often pre-application meetings, and the pre-application meeting sometimes is the spur of interest. And I think in this context, we're hoping that the spur of interest for certain project scopes and certain project elements begins sooner, so that when that interest comes in the door, they come to the counter proverbially, that the jurisdiction is prepared with that information. Moving on to identified for near-term provision in an adopted capital improvement plan. You'll recall that there was a variety of perspective on capital improvement planning, it being outside generally of the planning program and land use realm of conversation. However, it becomes incredibly important to the ability for a city to show that they have land that will be ready in this HPS timeline of 6 to 8 years. or 6 to 8 years -2 because of those 2 years needed for both the construction of the infrastructure and the construction of the housing in that target window. And you'll see that I've highlighted a variety of things. The capital improvement plan itself is somewhat ambiguous. There are some cities do a financially constrained list, some cities do a CIP that's a 5-year look at the whole city. Some cities do something completely different, and some cities don't have it at all. So this is where you'll find that there will be a lot of interpretation about what is near-term development ready. And as such, you'll see in some of the rule language that I've suggested that we identify those properties in perhaps a different color or show some kind of nuance included in the discernment between what is served and what can be developed today versus those properties that are promised to be served through some improvement plan or capital program. I think that's important. Just from the local planner in me is always a little bit concerned about putting out maps that are publicly available and folks making decisions based on them. And I feel that it might be disingenuous to indicate everything the same color, whether it's served right now or served sometime in the next 6 years. And that's, I think, something that nearly all of you as representatives of either districts or jurisdictions can or advocacy groups can appreciate, that it's nice to know the difference between those two things. That way folks don't make a decision based on a CIP project that, as a result of a variety of other decisions, whether it be outside money that we heard at infrastructure subcommittee, that if outside money comes in and we promote a project, suddenly the other projects on the CIP list get demoted or dissolve because our capacity is completely consumed by whatever funding we received from the legislature or otherwise. It would be a shame for someone to have made a development opportunity decision on that map, not knowing which is which. So that's just something to note and discern the difference of, and you'll see basically a discussion of that in the why it matters section in the memo. Lastly, we'll go to housing capacity and development ready lands. Again, we'll revisit that achieved density comment. It's critical that we think about zones in terms of what, I guess this brings in local context. So not all medium density zones or high density zones are created equally. And it in an attempt to seek fairness of what can a city count on for bread and butter in terms of capacity, must we require that they count on the highest and maximum density of a zone versus the minimum density of a zone? And I think buildable land, of taking cues from the buildable land inventory program, this achieved density context, I think works really well in saying that at least the property, though it's vacant or partially vacant, might be held to the standard that all other sites of the same zoning designation in the city are held to, which is that an achieved density is not an average or a mean or a median, rather. It's something contextual that all cities might have at hand because they've just recently performed their buildable land inventory, and now they're taking this next step into development ready land inventory. There is a question that you'll see later in the presentation that I would love to ask you all related to how cities note that capacity. So how they're required to report on it, both in the context of what is available and also development ready, and whether or not we ought to ask cities to both alliterate capacity of land and acreage of land, acreage of land and capacity of land. So there's a discernment between what amount of acreage is available, raw numbers of how many acres are out there in each zone, for example, versus what the capacity of those acres are, and how that helps a city or jurisdiction show that they are meeting their target, and their target is both a raw number and also might be translated in some contexts through the contextualized housing need process that would typically precede this work. So again, we're kind of grounding ourselves in where in the steps of the goal 10 analysis we might where this inventory lives. I think that's probably enough for us to chew on for the first moment. And I want to make sure that we were able to at least get a litmus read from you all related to how you ingested the memo first, and then we'll go to the straw poll related to the draft rule language.
Thanks so much, Maddie. So yeah, any initial questions, clarifying questions for Madeline before we get to our straw poll and kind of take people's temperature on what's been proposed thus far? Mary Kyle.
Are we going to discuss it more after the straw poll? I'm a little, or is this it? Okay, I can wait.
Just like last time, basically the straw poll is like, do we have major issues? Do we have minor issues? And then we follow up based on what we hear from the straw poll. So,
oh, so if I don't have major issues, but I have some clarifying questions, should I ask now?
Yes, please.
Okay. So on the readily served by adjacent public facilities, I thought I recalled that cities liked flexibility from something like 300 feet. And I see that there's some flexibility to say, well, we can actually serve it even if it's a little further away if there's an accepted development agreement. But is there room, or can there be room for, well, our service is maybe 400 feet away, but there's a really clear path for extending it? I would just like to have some built in for a city to not be tied to that. And not need a development agreement with a developer to be able to say that.
That's a fair point. I would put it back to the group, just knowing that was a fairly well accepted, in terms of, I think in terms of rough proportionality and the ability to assess that to a particular development. I think there might be, there's certainly a lot of fungibility that I think we talked a little bit in our meeting in July about the difference between water and sewer facilities, for example,
right,
and transportation facilities maybe having different standards. Yeah. So folks, if you feel called to do so, please share some of your thoughts on that topic about having a specific distance in mind.
Oh, it wasn't necessarily not to have a specific distance, but to have the flexibility built in for a city to say, well, ours is 400 feet, but we still want to, we're going to make our case for why that still should be in our readily serviced lands. I can't remember what it calls, the readily serviced lands. Right. So
thank you for that.
I get the kind of safe harbor 300 feet or whatever, but just having a flexibility for a city to make a case.
Thanks. Brock, we'll go to you. I know you have to leave early today, so go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's reasonable to say it can be more than 300 feet if there's an agreement there, but if there's not an agreement, then I think we should have kind of a base standard. The other thing I was going to say, I want to make sure that when we say 300 feet, we're not creating a situation where, like, say, for example, I'll use one that we've used in this rulemaking before, like with a island of buildable land. Right. So if you have to go around it or through constraints to get to it, then it's obviously not development ready. So I would, and I can submit something in writing to you guys in a minute, but, or not in a minute, soon. But an amendment to that definition of adjacent means that facilities exist that would require no more than 300 feet of infrastructure to be developed from the connection point to the property line.
Okay, thanks, Brock. Damien.
Thanks, Steve. I had a clarifying question on the phrase "an adopted capital improvement plan," because I think what's proposed is broad enough, and I wanted to clarify this, broad enough that it would capture an adopted 5-year CIP that has a project in it saying this can be built in year 3, but it's also flexible enough to say if a jurisdiction doesn't have that, but it has a goal 11 public facilities plan that says, we've got this project in years 1 through 5 of the 20-year CIP, that would then be something they could rely on to say it's going to have infrastructure in the near term.
I mean, that's the ambition. I'm glad you're reading it that way. I think we heard from both infrastructure subcommittee members and from you all in your July meeting that that's tricky because there is very little guidance at the state level related to that kind of capital programming generally. And I think it would be incumbent upon the jurisdiction to make those kinds of statements. This is the tool we're using to base our near-term provision criteria on. And I think then it's the qualification of that as valid for us DLCD and others to validate that and to say yes, that makes sense, or in fact no, there's no chance that you're going to get 50% of your water master plan projects completed in the 6-year time frame, and we need a little bit more of qualification of those projects in order to consider them near-term projects.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Damian. Martha.
Thanks. I have a number of comments and questions, so I'll try to limit it until we do the straw poll. But I think that the 300 feet that you were talking about, I feel like that comes out of the rules for sewer service provision, and the rules say legally and physically available, which the physically is the 300 feet, I believe, and the legally also you can take some other considerations into, like if you have to cross somebody else's property, it's not really legally available, and maybe that's what Brock was getting at. But also, I think we do need to keep in mind, and you did mention it, Madeline, that public facilities also include roads and transportation facilities. And I think located no more than 300 feet doesn't have a lot of meaning or isn't that meaningful when you are talking about transportation facilities. So I don't know what the right answer is, but I think that we need to be careful sort of how narrowly we are defining this. And sure, if it's sort of a safe harbor or like something like a jurisdiction is not required to consider facilities that are farther than 300 feet or something like that to give jurisdictions a little bit of flexibility and also maybe think about transportation facilities differently. That might be helpful. And the one other thing, the reason I raised my hand is I have a question about the term achieved density. I'm not familiar with that term. I'm with Clackamas County. We haven't done a goal 10 analysis yet. Is that actually defined somewhere? Is that something that you need to define in your buildable land inventory? Because I flagged it a couple times when I was reading this document and it talks about the achieved density, and I guess I don't know what that is.
If there's more description or if I characterize this incorrectly, please, Beth or Steve, folks that have a lot of experience with it, please jump in. But essentially, Martha, we recognize that nearly all zones that are used in land use have a range. Mm-hmm. And in the process of doing a buildable land inventory, jurisdictions are required to show what they've achieved within that range within a particular zone. And that helps to enumerate whether it's the basis on which a city determines whether or not they have sufficient buildable land to meet their housing target or their housing allocation, rather, in this context.
So that is actually a term and it's defined in the buildable land inventory rules. I didn't have time to go look them up.
In fact, a lot of the criteria for buildable land inventories are in statute, and statutorily it describes what amounts to achieved density, which is the jurisdiction shall show what density has been achieved in a particular particular zone, and they use that as the basis to determine capacity of that land.
Okay. So that makes me feel better. I think that if it is not actually defined somewhere, we should define that term. And maybe I'm the only one that doesn't totally understand it because I don't work for a city and haven't gone through the BLI before, but it just seemed like a new term that was coming out to me, and I didn't know truly what it meant. So anyway, we can move on. Thank you. I appreciate the clarification.
Thank you, Martha. Beth, did you have something to add specifically to this? Yeah.
Yeah, very briefly. It may well be, Martha, that it makes sense in some cases for things that are defined in statute but hard to understand to have that kind of definition in the guidebook, which will be under development. So.
Agreed. Yeah. Thanks, Beth. Sarah.
All right. Couple clarifying questions. I know, Maddie, you mentioned, and others have touched on kind of the reasons why, even if infrastructure is available within 300 feet, a city may not provide services to that area. And maybe it's not even on the capital improvement plan for those reasons. Say, you know, you have to cross a creek, or maybe a portion of the property has a different drainage, and so only a portion of that parcel can be served. But I just wanted to make sure that there's kind of an out for a city to say, no, even though this is within the 300 feet, it's not going to be development ready because there are, you know, we can engineer it, but whether it's cost, you know, timing, that I just wanted to make sure that there's some flexibility there for it to not be included. And then follow-up question on the achieved density. It seems a little odd that within a range of densities for a zone, that even if you could meet minimum density but not achieve density, that it wouldn't be considered development ready, because it's still within the densities of that zone. So just a thought.
Appreciate that perspective, Sarah. This is certainly an attempt to find middle ground. Minimum density, especially in the context of where we are. Just to zoom out a little bit on the development ready land inventory program as a whole, and think about this being the first cut of such a program. I was hoping that there's an opportunity for communities to think not just can the minimum density be achieved, but can it achieve the level of development that is typical of other properties throughout the city of the same zoning designation. And so, yes, there's a chance that that a property could develop at its minimum density, but it builds in a level of capacity that can't be achieved or can't be accomplished. And so there's a level that yes, it is ready for some development, but is it ready for the development of a lot that is typical of that zone in any other place in the city? And if it doesn't achieve that achieved density that others have done, I think there's certainly room for qualification, but I appreciate that many cities will say, well, if it achieves the minimum density, I want it to be considered development ready. So that's something that we're straddling in this work for sure. Thanks for highlighting that.
Yeah, thanks for that question, and thanks, Madeline. Also, thanks to Cotton for dropping the references to achieve density in the chat if anyone wants to look those up. Let's hear from Mary Kyle and then Damien, and then do our straw poll.
I think that's a really interesting comment that Sarah just made, because especially if it's a zone with a fair amount of density, say 20 to 40 units, and it's achieving 20, that's still great at 20 to 40 units per acre. We're not talking it's a single family home that's gone in a, you know, zone that could otherwise have up to 20 units per acre. So I'll share that concern. I had a question about the various ways in which lands that are encumbered by Goal 5 resources is the term. And so in some places it says you can't count as development ready land that is, you can't count it unless it's free from federal, state, or local limitations. And then draft definition says encumbered by Goal 5 resources or facilities that require discretionary permitting that has not already been processed. That seems really constrictive to me, since a lot of Goal 5 lands with Goal 5 designations can be developed. You just have to do it consistent with the Goal 5. And I don't know, over an 8-year period of development ready lands, I mean, I'm definitely not a developer, but I don't think they're going to be going in and getting entitlements to that property 7 or 8 years in advance. So it seems like weird timing, and so it just doesn't count those lands at all, as opposed to some discount for lands that have a Goal 5 overlay that you can still develop on, but there's restrictions on the amount of development, so you discount its capacity. But that seems very weird to me, based on whether or not you have entitlements in place for something that's an 8-year or 6 years in the metro area.
Thank you, Mary Kyle. All right, Damien.
Thanks, Steve. I had a question and a comment, hopefully one final comment on the term achieved density. When I read that, it took me back to the old Goal 10 guidebook. I think circa late 90s, it used the phrase actual density. So I wanted to confirm, even though we're talking achieved, we still mean actual in terms of what's actually built. My comment, or more of something to think about, is those situations where a city may have adopted a minimum density that's actually helping them get more units per acre, kind of some part way through their HPS period, and being able for them to kind of account for that, so they can explain why maybe densities might be not as good as they should be, but they're going to get better because of some changes they've made to their code.
Great. Thank you, Damien. Okay, let's go ahead. Ingrid, if you could assist us with our polling to kind of see where people feel about the proposed rules and guidance, and then we'll continue our conversation. So, do you support it as it is with any, I don't think we've discussed, specifically proposed any modifications so far. Support with minor refinement, or you think it needs significant work or additional work or discussion? I think we have about 10 TAC members with us today, so we'll give it another couple minutes. All right. I'll take 9. Oh, I think Brock left, so 9 is probably the number. So most people kind of feeling that we need some minor refinements. I have one comment to share from Ted Reed, which says, curious about how cities like Wilsonville that don't annex and zone until they have a development proposal would fit in. So that's another consideration. And then to continue our conversation, if the person who feels that major changes are needed has thoughts or comments they want to share, that's great. Otherwise, certainly open to hearing from specific thoughts from folks on minor modifications that they'd like to see. Starting with you, Martha.
I'll admit it was me. So a couple of things. One is, and will try not to take a ton of time, but
we got time.
I'm reacting to the word annexed still. And I know we had these conversations, and I know that you mentioned it in your presentation, Madeline, but my understanding of our prior conversations was that maybe there would be some changes to the definition. We had talked about changing the definition of development ready lands. The way it is right now, I'm at Clackamas County. Under this definition, we would have 0 development ready lands because our lands are not annexed. I guess they're annexed to the county. I don't know. And I feel like that is a lot of this is written with this lens of properties have to be annexed to a city to be developed at urban densities. And that's just quite frankly not the case in the metro area. And so I struggle a little bit fitting some of this into the urban unincorporated lands. And I read your footnote and I understand, I mean, you are acknowledging that, but the fact of the matter is we don't have the discretion to do, as we're, as a local jurisdiction implementing this, we, we can't decide whether or not annexed applies or not. If the state law says it does, then we have to, that, like, that's part of our definition, part of the definition. I don't have a good answer for how to resolve that. I thought the definition was going to change. But to me, that's a big issue, because it, like, literally was in the first page, and I had people asking me or looking at this like, well, I don't understand. Why does it still say annexed? So that's a big one. And like I said, I'm happy to continue to work with you on how to resolve that. But, you know, I sat on a work group for like a year and we spent a lot of painful time trying to define what urban unincorporated lands mean specifically for this purpose. Because in 2024, the legislature added this into, I don't know how the statute number on the top of my head, but specifically added it into the definition of a city. And so it's hard for me to like reconcile some of these disconnects. And so that's my first big comment. I agree, who was it that was talking about this achieved density, and and even if you can't meet your achieved density, doesn't it still belong in development ready lands? I mean, development ready to me means, can it be developed, right? Can it be developed in this time frame? When you look at densities, it's the capacity of like how much can be developed in that land. And so if we have these housing targets that we have to meet in 6 years, and we're looking at our BLI and we're looking at development ready lands, presumably the development ready lands are supposed to sort of tie into the capacity that we have to get, you know, that we have to meet our housing targets. And I don't think that properties should not be included in the development ready lands inventory just because they may not be able to achieve quite the density of another one. I think that you had different categories in there, and maybe it is a category of it's still development ready land, but maybe it does need some more help to get up to a density that we want, which is something that ties it to the housing production strategy. And then you can tie some of your strategies to like, well, we have these lands that can't, that we don't think are, that, you know, that we'd like to increase the capacity on, or you know, tie it in like that. But I think the inventory is the inventory. It's either development ready or it's not. It is how I feel about it. It's probably oversimplifying it a little bit. And then I guess also why I voted the way I voted. I feel like there's some inconsistencies in the draft language that will make it potentially difficult for a jurisdiction to do this analysis. One of the things that is making me twitch a little bit is even just this idea of how we're defining what lands we look at. Because in some places it says zone to allow housing, right? And other places it says residential zones, and those are not the same things. I mean, at least in the county, almost all of our commercial zones allow housing. Does that mean we have to count that? And I feel like that's clarified in the buildable land inventory maybe, but this should be consistent with that. And then I'll stop there. I think I need to think through a little bit more about some of these definitions and whether or not, when we're talking about facilities, whether how roads tie into that, because I feel like this may be very limiting, for transportation. And specifically, if we look at the definition of readily served, I'm wondering if it limits a jurisdiction's ability to get road improvements through a development, or because it says that, or if it's, if it's limiting how we define development ready lands, because to me, it implies that we can't, if somebody has to do road improvements, it wouldn't be development ready land because it says no off-site, or I don't know what oversized facilities to serve adjacent development is required. And so I'm not entirely sure what that means, but I feel like it could easily be read to mean, I mean, a road improvement is off-site, it's in the right of way. And so I feel like that needs some tweaking. But anyway, I will stop with that, but those are my sort of big issues right now.
That's great, Martha. Thank you. Thank you for getting
Mhm.
the conversation rolling. I'm going to go to Beth and then Madeline, if you have anything you want to, any reflections regarding Martha's comments. But Beth, why don't you go first?
I was going to ask Martha a question or two right back. In terms of annexed, I think we're talking about lands that are within the Metro UGB that are not annexed into one of the cities there. So like some of the Oak Lodge area land, some of that kind of land. Am I right about that, Martha?
So annexed, as far as I know, means annexed into a city. If
All
we're
right, I just
talking about lands inside an urban growth boundary, that's different.
yeah. It is, and what I suspect we might need is some sort of exception for areas that are urban unincorporated within the Metro UGB because they're functioning differently than land that's say in the Coos Bay UGB that is not annexed into the city. And so maybe that just takes some sort of exception, which, Metro is an exception all the time. Um,
Well,
I mean, it's true.
no, you're right. And that, I mean, um that's why at the time we took a lot of time to try to define urban unincorporated lands because those are fairly specific to the Metro UGB. I think maybe there's some around Salem. I'm not entirely sure. But they are lands that kind of act like a city. I mean, both Washington County has almost 200,000 people in their urban unincorporated area. We've got like 100 in Clackamas County. It kind of acts like a city, and that's why it was added in here, right?
Yeah.
Um, and it's added into the definition.
Hmm.
And so there needs to somehow be, maybe it's currently annexed to a city or located within the urban unincorporated lands. I mean, maybe it's that simple as changing the definition to make it clear that it doesn't have to be annexed to a city. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Sort of.
that's exactly what I was suggesting.
Okay.
And then on the achieved density, just in listening to what people were saying, maybe development ready land isn't necessarily, able to develop fully at achieved density, but at some percentage of the achieved density, so that you're not counting land that could develop at really low densities. That's, way below what you could achieve otherwise in other development ready land of that same zone. And so maybe there needs to be some consideration of that. I'll just throw that in there, and that's all I had.
Well, and
Thank-
actually that is one of your questions, I think, as I'm looking through your document, is question number 3. So I know you contemplated it, and I guess my answer would be yes.
Madeline, any observations before I move on? Okay.
I would have just referenced the questions that are going to come up soon, as Martha, you've just touched on.
Perfect. Sam.
Yeah, I was actually going to mention one, or kind of mention the 20% redevelopment threshold, and I see that's actually question number 5. So maybe I'll withhold my comment. But when we do get to that, I was just wondering where that threshold really came from. Obviously, when we're talking about City of Portland, that is we would easily meet that, and we see that regularly. We just don't have a lot of vacant land, but we do see a lot of redevelopment. So
Thanks, Sam. We'll put a pin in that and get back to that in a bit. Heather and then Damien. Sorry, Damien. Whoa.
Sorry, I just wanted to comment on a couple of things that were said, and then I also will wait on some of my other questions that are in questions 1 through 5. But regarding the annexation, I don't know if Eugene's the only jurisdiction, but we actually have some areas that have services and are not annexed. And so urban levels of development are happening, like really happening without those properties being annexed. So there's an annexation agreement that the property is allowed to sign, and we have that on file. So I'd like to see a provision for that. So kind of similar issue actually to Metro, but from a different angle to the Metro area. I also had the question about actual versus achieved densities. I think what I'm worried about with the capacity part is that I'm hoping we don't end up doing 2 different types of capacity analysis. Like when we do our BLI, we look at our development trends, and we do come up with an average that we see over the last 10 years of development and those densities per comp plan designation and the size of the lot and the slope of the lot and a bunch of other land characteristics. And then we apply those same average densities, whatever those are. They may be upper average as far as the minimum and the maximum, or lower, but whatever that is, we apply that to other land with the same characteristics as the assumed capacity. And I would hate to have to do something different. I'm hoping that when we say, the actual or the achieved or whatever, we're just saying, what is the capacity that was assumed on this property for the BLI? And that's what we're counting as the development capacity for that lot. So I just wanted to make sure, because there's been a lot of options thrown out there. Thanks.
The intent, Heather, is to try to use what cities and jurisdictions have in hand from their BLI to apply to the development ready land, and how that's enumerated is a question within the 5 that are coming up.
All right, let's go to Damien, and then we can loop back to those more detailed questions.
Thanks, Steve. I'll be brief. I had another, I think, recommended refinement to Exhibit A or Attachment A to the memo. Under the definition of near term, I think there needs to be an additional letter, maybe a letter C or expand B, to refer to projects that are in a capital improvement plan developed through a Goal 11 public facilities plan. Because the way I was reading B, in terms of referring to an adopted system plan's financially constrained project list, that takes me to the TSP under Division 12. So I was recommending a refinement to expand that to include Goal 11 public facility plans. Thank you.
Thanks, Damien. Back to you, Madeline, unless you want, yeah, there we go.
Great, you'll have to bear with me. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty getting the slides up on my screen, but we'll run through them. If you all don't mind, you'll see a little bit of the sausage making by seeing the slide and instead of being in the slideshow. I think we'll start off here by thank you for those comments, and I appreciate the thought that you all have put into this. It's incredibly detailed and also challenging to meet each of and every circumstance, because this is obviously something that's new, and there are certainly some areas that you'll see both explained in the memo and in the wording of proposed language that we'll certainly need to adapt and change to some of the examples that you've shared. So thank you for that. I did highlight a few areas, and I'm glad that they came up naturally in conversation. I thought I'd illuminate those really specifically here and offer opportunities for folks to weigh in on these topics in specific. And the first comes from some of the conversation that we had in the July meeting about of last year, and stems from the conversation we had at our last meeting on the 3rd of April around constraints. And there's I'll admit that some of the draft language doesn't have strong analytical basis. It likely is a number or a percentage that's aimed at starting a conversation about, is this right, or is this enough, or ought there be a different amount assumed? So please, if you take particular issue with a number, thank you, Sam, for saying so. In this context, I think you'll see in the proposed language I've highlighted 50% constrained, meaning is it more than a majority of the property that is constrained by natural physical constraints that we've illuminated in the BLI process, for example. This is, again, we're talking about, and Martha, you'll have to forgive me because I'm going to refer to annexed again in the context of inside city limits. I think if we, without addressing your question, because unfortunately the definition is included in statute and the scope of our work is to recommend rules, we're unable to change that word, but perhaps while we're talking about it, let's just understand that, and we're going to broaden the definition of annexed to those lands that are required statutorily to perform a development ready land inventory. So in this case, we're talking about land that's not the UGB, but rather the city limits or the incorporated area that a city has jurisdiction on, that they're required to do an inventory for. Those boundaries might be really specific in urban lands context. They're definitely very specific in the context of cities and their incorporated boundaries. And the question is, how much of a parcel can be constrained or may be constrained in order for it to still be considered development ready? I grasped at a number 50%. Because my instinct as a local planner in thinking about doing partitions and other types of land divisions, the basis is typically that you shall not make a parcel that is more than 50% or more of any particular constraint or hazard, thus rendering it undevelopable. In this context, you'll note that there are likely lots of parcels, and colleagues within DLCD have highlighted that parcels might be very large, and therefore the constraint, even at 50%, may not constrain a parcel to exclude development necessarily. And this might be a question of where we come back to achieve densities and thinking about how that land can be counted as capacity while still being or maintaining some level of physical constraint. And I wonder if there are thoughts in the room about that making that statement or reaching that conclusion about that for clarity.
Martha.
I have thoughts. Well, I have a question before my thought is, and my question is, when you say how much constraint, and it references physical constraints in the draft language, is that defined somewhere? Like what are we talking? Is that specifically defined? Like which constraints we are looking at?
It's defined at least in the buildable land inventory process. And so perhaps there needs to be a reference to that in particular.
I just want to make sure that it's very specific what a jurisdiction is allowed to look at. And you don't have a jurisdiction that's just like, well, we seem like there might be a wetland there. We're gonna say it's constrained. I mean, not that anyone really would, but I mean, well, they might, but I just want to make sure that there's a very clear connection to what this definition is and exactly what sort of data we need to look at to get to this point. So that's my first point. I don't know that I have a strong feeling about what percentage, because I feel like it just depends on the type of constraint. And it depends on the property. And I guess I would fall back on, well, just because something has a constraint doesn't mean it's not development ready. If it meets all of these other criteria, it just might not be able to have as much capacity. There are some constraints, at least in our urban area, where you're allowed to transfer the density out of a constrained area. And so theoretically, you are not even losing density. And so I just feel like it's not like a straight number. I'm not sure how other people feel about it.
Thanks,
And I
Martha.
guess if
Oh.
there is a straight number, there should be flexibility to maybe do something different if you have justification.
All right, I'm seeing some nodding heads. Let's go to Sam.
I keep lowering my hand instead of unmuting. I 100% agree with Martha. I think there's a lot of nuance there depending on property type, site size, constraint type, and the market generally, right? Markets like ours can afford, developers can typically afford to deal with a constraint a lot better than a sort of a lower cost market. I'd say beyond that, the sort of the 50% number, if we're thinking about cumulative constraint rate, so to speak, in terms of like a near-term development, I would struggle to argue that a developer would look at that and say, yeah, this is, I'm going to reduce my cap of like overall capacity by 50%. Therefore, that's kind of a near-term development opportunity. I think when you look at that on the industrial side, you tend to say it's sort of more in the like 20%, 25% range. And so I would argue that number probably should be lower, generally speaking.
Thanks, Sam. Let's go to Damien and then Heather, and then we'll move on with the next question.
Thanks, Steve. To add some potential complexity to this, I was thinking of a number greater than 50%. Especially depending on the type of housing you're looking at, and the simple example: if someone has a lot in a subdivision, but a constraint covers 1/2 or less, there's still some buildable area there. But if the constraint covers more than half the lot, it may still be developable, but maybe not within that HPS time period. So just some additional comment to think about.
Thank you, Damien. And Heather.
Yeah, I just want to second what everyone said. And I think it shows why there's the need for more of a spectrum or a way to demonstrate something differently. I mean, in my mind, I was thinking the lot has already gone through its buildability analysis. And so what portion of the lot is not buildable, and you're counting capacity on the portion that is. So I'm not sure why we wouldn't be able to count the portion of the lot that is buildable. I mean, presumably there's other metrics that you might be getting into, like if that portion is a sliver or, those kinds of things, you might toss it out anyway, for counting capacity on it. So I just wonder how necessary it is to come up with an actual number and maybe refer back to the buildable lands inventory instead of having a specific number, and or putting in the allowance that maybe here is the spot where you can say some criteria that allows the jurisdiction to say you may count it in your buildable lands inventory, but for the purposes of the development readiness, you aren't, with documentation, but I think that hard number is difficult.
To that, Heather, and I appreciate the reference back to the buildable land inventory, I think the question really does get back to a comment actually that Mary Kyle you raised earlier about timing and the question of whether or not a developer has pursued, or the owner has pursued any kind of mitigation process that might be required to address the constraint. And so it might be considered buildable in that 20-year horizon. However, in this shorter term window, i.e. the production of it within 6 or 8 years, there's just it's a little bit more tenuous unless the developer or owner has started that mitigation process or whatever is required to address it. And just as like a zoom out, just to think about how cities, what the consequences are or trade-offs are in some of this language, is like a lot of this is trying to strike some level of middle ground based on a lot of the comments that you've offered and folks from the subcommittee have offered in thinking about how cities will cope with the likelihood that they may not have a sufficient amount of development ready land to meet their target. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I want to maybe bring some of that spirit into the conversation as we get into the next question about how about a little
Maddie,
bit. Yes, please.
Can I just respond to that really quick?
Absolutely.
So in general, I guess I was wondering if when we have these specific numbers, somebody mentioned this earlier about having those be safe harbors instead of having it be the only criteria. So yeah, I totally hear what you're saying, but that might be a way to bridge the issue a little bit.
Right, Heather. And I wanted to get to apologize because I realize we have limited time and I've stacked up a number of questions. So something just to get into this question that Martha, you brought up and others have brought up around transportation facilities. And I wanted to get a read of the room about how folks feel about leaving the level of service question, the sufficiency question, up to a jurisdiction around certain elements that are related to public facilities or public city standard. Every city has a different public works design standard for facilities. And for us to alliterate what those are and how those are is likely challenging and nearly impossible. And I wonder what folks feel like in terms of not really speaking to level of service, but that's the onus of that is on the jurisdiction to describe or explain as a qualifier to how they've interpreted this for the purposes of the inventory.
I see a thumbs up from Casera and others. Maddie, maybe in the interest of time, people are saying, let's go on to the next question.
Next question. Should there be a category of parcels that are served but can't, again, we've touched on it, can't achieve density of their zoning designation? I think I heard a pretty strong call for if it can achieve minimum density, then that's adequate to qualify as development ready. I wonder if that's how that lands with everyone. If there are reasons to speak otherwise, please, now is a good time to raise your hand.
Yeah, either a thumbs up or if anyone disagrees with that, please raise your hand.
Okay, great. When quantifying sufficient development ready land, should rules specify that land be quantified by acreage? So I guess I'm imagining and CalTech staff team have imagined that similar to buildable land inventory, that a city would enumerate land that is development ready by acres. We have 600 acres of development ready land within that meet the definition. If it is development ready, meaning the facility is readily served, and or promised are both considered development ready. So you, as long as you meet the definition of development ready from 197A 015, you can qualify those lands as development ready. There are lands, however, that might have an asterisk or might, you know, a timeliness factor or a contingency factor might be required. But we think about quantifying those by acreage. So that could be net buildable acres from the BLI, as Heather has highlighted and might be highly recommended. It could simply be a gross number of acres, or should that land be delineated by capacity based on its achieved density, so that you can show a direct correlation between the land that's available, that's development ready, and the target. Thoughts?
Thoughts on how to quantify that, or the best way to quantify that? Not seeing any brave souls. Martha, always the brave soul.
I would say both. Again, not having done a buildable lands inventory, really, I mean, I work with Metro and theirs, but I would say if you're doing a BLI and you have your buildable lands, and then you have your sort of your net acreage and capacity in your BLI, correct? I mean, that's like the outcome. So then why, and this is a subset, why wouldn't you report the same things? I think the capacity is very important because that's how you're looking at whether or not you can meet your housing targets. But I feel like it would be useful to show how much of a subset, you know, how big the subset is of your overall buildable land inventory, also in acreage.
Thanks, Martha. Damien and then Beth.
Keep it simple. I would agree with both acres and capacity.
Great. Beth?
I'll just quibble and say it should be in gross acres. So when you say gross acres, you mean land that's not including land to rights of way. So that you can compare that to the buildable lands inventory, because that land also doesn't generally include land for rights of way. It hasn't accounted for it. And I think, well, both sounds good to me.
All right. And we saw some thumbs up for that. So let's keep moving.
Thank you for this rapid fire session. I really appreciate it. Hopefully it feels like we're getting somewhere. Okay, back to Sam's point about redevelopment as a percentage. The 20% came from a somewhat, it was presumed to be somewhat generous, but I appreciate your feedback, Sam, that it may not be generous for cities in particular that don't have the ability to expand a growth boundary, for example. So of course you count on redevelopment for a substantial amount of your ability to accommodate future growth through redevelopment. Portland is a fairly unique case. There are other cities throughout the state. I think Astoria comes to mind, that have some significant limitations about their ability to expand their growth boundary. However, the 20% is looking at a variety. Thank you, Beth, and other team members from Echo Northwest for going back in your work and looking at what were some of the assumed redevelopment capacity numbers that cities could justify or use in their buildable land inventory. The concern, why name it? Why even address it in rule, is that there's a, I don't want to call it a bad actor, or hedging against the likelihood that a city goes through a development ready land inventory. They identify what land they have available for development within the time frame, and then they say, and the rest will be provided by redevelopment. So sure, we meet our target because there's no basis to assume or presume the likelihood or unlikelihood of redevelopment capacity, unless we say with some certainty that there is a bookend on redevelopment. Thoughts?
I was going to give Sam first opportunity if you have any additional thoughts on your earlier comments.
Yeah, I can see the difficulty in that and the bad actor piece of it. But I think, you know, if if you're able to, if a jurisdiction is able to properly quantify and give adequate rationale for a high redevelopment number, I think that should be in the rules. We should be allowed to do that. Whether that's through a sort of a feasibility analysis and looking at the redevelopment rate. Those are two things that you can do, and we do already. That result in a higher than 20% redevelopment threshold.
Thank you, Martha.
Thanks. And I'm gonna have to hop off after this comment, but I agree. I think it's more than just Portland or even in Astoria that may have much higher redevelopment. I think of like a Milwaukee that doesn't have its own urban growth boundary to expand. Unincorporated Clackamas County, different issues, but most of our development is infill. We don't have a lot of vacant urban land. There will be a lot of redevelopment, and I'm just wondering, because you do have to have a basis in your BLI, right, for identifying how much land is redevelopable. I mean, what if you were somehow to tie it to like a no greater percentage, of overall land than you're identifying in your BLI or something like that, somehow tying it back to your BLI, because I feel like you have to justify the redevelopment. I would hope that DLCD would send back a housing capacity analysis that just says, oh, the rest of it will be done through redevelopment. I feel like there needs to be some sort of mathematical justification for it. If not, there should be. But I do need to hop off. I have a hard stop. It was good to see everybody. Y'all don't have to listen to me anymore.
Thank you, Martha.
Thank you, Martha.
Yeah.
Let's go to Kevin real quick, and then Madeline, if you have any last comments, and then I'll wrap us up. Kevin?
Want to follow up on comment that was just made. Yeah, I mean, we do have the 3% cap now in statute in terms of density assumptions. So there is some obligation for jurisdictions to prove up on redevelopment assumptions. That's something that a lot of local governments can do based on data they have now. I just reviewed the Metro UGB, and the data there is pretty compelling. But there is a burden of proof on that stuff.
Thank you, Kevin. Madeline, did you have anything? Last thoughts?
That's it. I wanted to make sure that that I thanked everyone for your thoughts and time today. I know we didn't get through all of the questions that I've posed in the memo. Please, if you do have the capacity to do so, we'll make available an opportunity for you to respond to those questions. We will also bring back changes to this work and other draft rule proposals at a future meeting. I think we're working, either Cotton sent out a workflow recently, or we're about to provide you with one that will show when this will pop back up in our agenda. But I just wanted to express gratitude for your review. And if you do feel and or have capacity to do so, please don't hesitate to send the material with comments or questions from anyone you work with or your teams that you represent to me. Either any kinds of edits, either in Word or on that PDF that was sent out, are more than welcome.
Maddie, just one more minute from me. I'm going to echo Maddie's. I mean, clearly everyone has spent time looking through these materials, and it's really appreciated. Our next meeting is on May 1st. We'll be looking at partially vacant and infill and redevelopment, I believe, if I'm getting this right from the new schedule, and maybe revisiting the BLI in terms of areas that can't be served. As Madeline said, whether it's the mural board or some other method, we welcome and encourage additional thoughts and comments that you might have. It's a new topic, so Madeline, thanks for your work diving into this, and I think as a group we're going to make some progress and address these different issues raised today. So thanks everyone, and enjoy your afternoon, and we'll see you in a few weeks.